Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Saachi Kuwayama, the Environmental Justice Policy Manager at the EDF Action. I'm so excited to be here tonight, moderating this important and timely discussion. Here at EDF Action, we work to stand up for voting rights and the integrity of our nation's democracy. As we're all looking ahead to the midterm elections this year, it's a crucial time to discuss voting rights and the importance of your vote in November. We surveyed our members across the country to determine the topics you all are most excited to hear about in the voting rights and democracy space. And based on your input, we'll be discussing voter ID laws, voter suppression, and the connection between democracy and environmental work. We have an amazing panel of speakers with us tonight from prominent voting rights organizations across the country. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to our viewers for being with us. Now we'll jump right in. To begin our program tonight, we'll hear from James Slattery from the Texas Civil Rights Project on voter suppression laws and how they're impacting Texans. James is the Texas Civil Rights Project's senior staff attorney focused on voting rights and electoral protection efforts. James previously led TCRP's initiative to boost voter registration rates among high school students and encourage young people to turn out to vote. James also has years of experience in voter protection and voting rights issues with electoral campaigns. James, thank you so much for being here. I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for joining. So here in Texas, and we're not alone in all this, but we've seen voter suppression manifest itself in a number of ways, both this year in 2022 and in the past. In 2022, the biggest voting issue that we've faced so far arises from a bill that was enacted last year called Senate Bill 1. And among among its many provisions, the one that's had the most impact so far is a new requirement for when people vote by mail. They have to provide their driver's license number if they have one, or if they don't, their social security number when they both apply for a mail ballot and when they return their mail ballot on the return carrier envelope. And that number has to match what is in the voter's official voter registration file. Now, you might think, oh, well, that sounds simple and easy on its face. What's the big deal? But basically, everything that could go wrong with this has, in fact, gone wrong. So first of all, the voter's official file on file with the county often doesn't include all of the potential ID numbers and social security number they may have. So for instance, when I moved to Texas, I registered to vote with my social security number because I did not yet have a Texas driver's license. Now that I have a Texas driver's license, I would be required to put that number down, even though that number was not on the voter registration form I submitted way back when. The state promised that its systems would be able to absorb ID numbers from other databases, such as our motor vehicle department. But that has proved to be not true in many thousands of cases. So voters are essentially putting down, say, their driver's license number, but it does not match what is in the elections file because it has not, through one way or another, absorbed that number either from the voter before or the driver's license department. Even when you get past that hurdle, though, or let's say that problem happens, the voter still potentially has the opportunity to correct that number if they get it wrong in the first place or something goes wrong. But even there, the voter first has to be notified that, hey, your number didn't match. And voters often forget that number. They see the mailing, but they think it's junk mail, or they open it, it's in dense legalese, they don't know, they don't understand what they're getting, and they just put it aside. But even when voters do get that notice that, hey, something has gone wrong with their vote by mail materials, um, the process for fixing it is hideously complex. You can potentially go on a website and cure it, but you have to find the website, you have to find the field that you're supposed to put it in. And sometimes, because of the kind of Byzantine process that Texas created, voters are actually sent their ballot back to them so that they have to fill out the ballot itself and then return the ballot in enough time for it to get back to the county elections office by election day. Uh, all of which there might be things that go wrong, not least of which is something gets lost in the mail or gets delayed in the mail. This had a huge effect on our elections in March. Statewide, over 12% of vote by mail ballots were rejected. In prior elections, that figure was closer to 1%. So something like a 6 to 12 fold increase in vote by mail rejections, almost all of which we know were as a result of this law. Now, the number of voters rejected in the primary was not that high because it was a low turnout election. But if 12% of people had their ballots rejected in the 2020 presidential election, that would have been 120,000 voters, which is enough to fill 1.5 football stadiums. The other voter suppression big thing we've seen in recent years are voter purges. And so in 2019, our Secretary of State tried to institute a program whereby if you had gone to get a driver's license and you had indicated at some point that you were not a citizen, you would be flagged for further investigation and potential purging from the voter registration rolls. But the system did not check to see whether you had naturalized as a citizen after being flagged by the system, which would have, of course, meant that you were an eligible voter. And this put at risk 90,000 voters. And the whole effort was only stopped because of litigation. Looking forward to November, we're, of course, worried about incidents like these, but also new powers that have been given to partisan poll watchers who will be stationed at the polls with the power to object and potentially intimidate voters. And many of those people are being recruited from the Stop the Steal movement that has been interfering in elections. So those are some of the big voter suppression issues we've been seeing in Texas recently.
Thank you so much for that amazing briefing. We really, really appreciate your time joining us this evening. Now we're going to turn next to another segment. This portion of our program will be focused on the importance of civic engagement this cycle and the connection between democracy and environmental work. I am pleased to introduce two incredible leaders to participate in this discussion. Heather Toney is EDF Action's Vice President of Community Engagement. Heather's work is focused on ensuring that EDF centers people in every climate solution. She works with a diverse range of stakeholders and constituency groups to develop strategies to reach our organization's climate goals. Heather previously served as the first African American, first female, and youngest mayor of Greenville, Mississippi. She also worked in the Obama administration as a regional administrator for the EPA. Welcome, Heather. And Stephanie Young is the executive director of When We All Vote. Created by Michelle Obama, When We All Vote is a national, nonpartisan initiative that brings together individuals, institutions, brands, and organizations to register new votes and advance civic education. Stephanie has more than 15 years of experience in communications, engagement, and content strategy. Stephanie previously served in the Obama White House as a senior public engagement advisor. Welcome, Heather and Stephanie. Thank you so much for being here. Now I'll pass it over to Heather to get this conversation started.
Thanks so much, Saachi. And hello, everyone. And hi, Stephanie. How are you doing today? It's great to see you.
I'm good. So good. Glad to be here with you. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. And what a wonderful time to talk about voting and the engagement in voting, why it's so important for us to be here in this topic in this moment. Getting into this conversation, I want to start with something simple. And hopefully it doesn't take you as far back as it takes me. But I would love for you to share with us, what do you remember about the first time that you voted?
It's when I turned 18, I can't even remember what year that was.
I feel the same way.
Oh my God. I know it was not a general election. I think it was a midterm election. I don't really remember much, but I do remember, getting registered to vote was like a no-brainer. I never thought about it. My first kind of voting memory was when I lived in South Africa during the transition from apartheid to democracy. I got to see that take place as a kid living there and experiencing that first fair and free election. So that's kind of like my first, even though I wasn't a voter, I remember seeing the ballot. I remember all of those things and being very excited for that moment where a new democracy was emerging. So I would like to say that was my first voting memory as opposed to me actually going in and casting a ballot, because it's 18 was a little bit ago for me.
It's crazy. Also, I'm trying not to date myself as well, and think about it to give you any clue or idea sort of where my brain was and just sort of thinking about this question and getting into the conversation. I remember as a kid, my parents walking into a booth and there being like a curtain that you drew around with like this big cross thing, thing that you had to do. And I wanted to be able to just like pull that curtain closed by myself.
Okay.
With nobody else in there but me. Like, that was the exciting thing about turning 18 and voting. And I think, I raised that because as we're talking about the importance of civic action right now, especially with respect to environmental policy, what's changed? And in all of the years, I'm going to say all the years, since we've started voting, what have you seen shift and change that makes now such a critical moment for people to be engaged?
Yeah, I mean, so much has changed. We just heard about all of the voter suppression that is, that's rampant right now all around this country. I'd like people to think back to 2013 when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act and made it harder for states that have a history of discrimination on the basis of race. Places like Alabama, Georgia, where I'm from, Texas, Florida. You saw a big shift, right? Because people came out in droves in 2008 and 2012. And that was the beginning of the concerted effort to say, how are we going to stop people who might not vote in the way we want them to vote from voting? So all these voter suppression bills that have either passed, in states, and some have just been introduced, but many have passed, have really made it harder for us to vote. And as we look back and think about the voting history in this country, we haven't really updated our system. Some states have done it really, really well, and then others are lagging behind and make things way more complicated. At this point, we should all have really automatic voter registration, and organizations like ours should kind of like be out of business because so many people are registered to vote. But I think the good news is that we have seen voter participation increase, especially among young voters. In 2020, 50% of young people voted. That's the highest youth voter turnout in modern history. And because youth voters turned out and people made their voices heard in droves, we had over 60% participation in 2020. You had pieces of legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act that is actually going to make a dent when it comes to combating climate change. And when you think about Gen Z, they're the next generation that's going to lead this nation, and their voting power is huge. They literally are, I believe, are about 1/3 of American voters. So things have changed when it comes to the folks who actually have access to the ballot box. So the power shift is definitely different. And I think that many are running scared. And that's why we're seeing this retaliation against voting in this country, because folks can see a little later on down the line, certain people are going to lose power because of how diverse this new electorate is. and that they're actually voting. And our goal is to hopefully to get them to vote in high numbers this midterm election season.
That power shift is it's becoming so obvious, especially in different levels of races, whether it's local, state, or federal, continuing to see how we have such diverse candidates that are not only running, but also helping and serving in a number of different capacities.
Yeah.
In that campaign cycle. And that's just as equally and important. Do you think the path forward for 2022, we're coming up to midterm elections, do you think that path forward runs in one particular way, or what are we up against when we think about this cycle? What is it going to take to really have a climate focused, candidate path or voting path?
Yeah, look, I think that a couple of things. People don't recognize and realize how much power is actually in the midterm elections. You have 435 members in the House of Representatives that are up for re-election. So you can look at all of those representatives and say, do they support my values in any area, right? Including climate. And you can make a decision. And we know that historically midterm election voter turnout is lower. However, in 2018, we saw the highest turnout for any midterm election. So we're hoping to keep it at the same level. And not just, those 435 members of Congress, we're talking about at least 30 something members of the Senate will also be up for re-election. So we're talking about real shifting in power potentially in both the House and the Senate that will make decisions on climate and many other issues going forward. So we can't afford to sit out this election season at all because that's where the decisions are going to be made. And beyond that, we have governors up for election. We have the people who are going to make these decisions for you. And I don't think people realize this, but 99% of our elected positions are at the state and local level. So that means that only about 1% of folks that we are voting for are at the federal level. So this is some real actual concrete change that we could see depending on the folks that we vote into office this season that could actually make further changes and efforts when it comes to the way in which we combat climate change in this country. And also, when you do have such major pieces of legislation that pass, you need folks in states that are going to help this ball move forward, right?
Yes. It's going to happen, right? The spaces where it's actually going to happen, it's on the ground in the local level. So you need everybody from your governors to your members of the state legislature, city council members, school board members, because
literally
everybody. I think that is such the point that we should reiterate to people, because so oftentimes I think we think it's just like one particular place, like there's one group that's going to implement and put all of this stuff into action, when in reality it takes everybody. But sort of going back to something that you just said around not only the percentage, but encouraging people to get there and to actually be a part of every segment of voting. We're both from the South, right? I'm from Mississippi and you're from Georgia, so we're Southern girls by birth and nature. But is it just me, or do you often feel like the rest of the country sometimes counts us out because they feel like that our politics don't shift? Like, do they not see us? I wonder that sometimes. Do you feel like that, or what do you?
I absolutely feel like that. I feel like we make investments, especially as voting organizations. We're a nonpartisan organization, but at the end of the day, we make investments in places where you do see lower voter participation and turnout, but all those states consistently look the same. And if you look at Georgia in particular, I'm old enough to remember when we had a Dixiecrat, which is also a Democrat, but
we're about the same age, Stephanie.
So I remember when he was governor, and that was the last Democratic governor that Georgia had. And organizations like the New Georgia Project worked really hard, not in a partisan way, but worked really, really hard to register voters all over that state and engage consistently. But it didn't happen in 2 days or 2 months or 2 years. It happened in 10 years, where you saw a difference in what Georgia looks like because of that consistent long-term engagement. And that's why when we all vote said, we want to expand the states that we work in. We don't want to just work in the states that people consider to be battleground states. So we're in South Carolina, we're in Louisiana, we're in Alabama, we're in Mississippi, we're in Texas, because we believe it's important to make investments in these states that don't receive a lot of national attention at times, but bring them into the organizing fold so that, they're great organizations doing the work. So how do we support them in doing that work and give them even more resources? Because we have a ton of young people, we have a ton of people of color in high numbers, and it just makes no sense not to invest in these states.
Absolutely. And the wonderful thing about technology is we can support people in places where we don't live and are not registered, because exactly as you said, there are amazing people who are running for office in places that may not be a New York or a California, but they are not only vesting a good part of their self in their work, they're representing communities that for so long have gone underrepresented and have been marginalized. And I think that's, it's amazing. Every woman I see that I come across, I always say, just give me your Cash App or whatever your funding mechanism is, and I can give you $5. Like, we can all do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
To find ways to support people. Let's shift a little bit to climate here. There's a Yale study that shows that Black and brown people are more likely to vote for climate policies than any other demographic in the nation. And every time I say that, it sort of blows away folks who are like, really? Is that the truth? I didn't know that.
Yeah. I didn't know that either.
It's Yale study. Pew has done the study. Like, everybody who studies stuff has studied it, to say that we're not only turning out, but that's a major issue for communities of color. As we have recently passed the Inflation Reduction Act, this could be, and I think is a really tremendous opportunity to see how we implement climate action, but everybody has to turn out to vote.
Right.
People have to keep showing up. Can you share with us a bit about that connection as you see it between climate action and voting, and ways that we can implement things like the Justice 40 and the bipartisan infrastructure bill and now the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, what's so I'm so happy to hear that stat. I'm aware that obviously
I'm about to get it and send it to somebody so we can get it in the chat.
Yeah, we can start putting some information out there. But yeah, look, I think at the end of the day, our communities are more impacted. We see climate change because of the communities that we live in, or beyond just the climate change piece. We're in communities where, from air pollution to being next to these factories and all of these things that have created chronic illnesses like asthma. We understand how climate actually impacts our lives firsthand because of those experiences. And if it's not us individually, it's our cousins, it's our grandmothers, it's people who live, in certain neighborhoods. And, all of these different pieces of legislation, right, from the Inflation Reduction Act to the infrastructure bill, if you think about Black and brown communities, you think, they're always across the street from a railroad track, or better yet, they have an expressway going right through the community that hurts the property value. So all of these things that we can actually see and feel and touch. And I think that when any legislation that is out there and that's going to make our lives better, but we actually can see the change from it, that helps to increase voter participation, voter turnout, because you can actually point to something that has been done in a way that people actually live and understand. And I think honestly, one of the reasons why we had high voter turnout is because we were in the middle of a global pandemic and everybody felt what it feels like to have a government who doesn't have your back and who's not taking care of you, or a governor who doesn't care about wearing masks, or all these different things, right? These things that we can touch and see and feel. And, for everybody who wants to get involved and be a part of making sure that people get out there to make their voices heard, we have some really good evidence to show that when we do vote, things actually change. And we also can really point to what's at stake. So we're really looking forward to targeting young people, millennials, Gen Z, really talking about, climate as much as we can. Unfortunately, climate has been deemed a partisan issue by the IRS, and as a 501c3, we're sometimes limited in the way in which we talk about it, but we're still going to make sure that people understand the facts about these different pieces of legislation, especially the Inflation Reduction Act, so that they understand how it impacts their lives and understand the power and the connection of their vote, so that that they don't miss the opportunity to make their voices heard.
It's so important to really embrace everything that you're talking about in this moment, because this is a pivotal moment for us.
It is.
We're dealing with extreme weather, heat waves that impact minority communities worse than any other part of the country. You've got crazy floods, hurricanes, wildfires, all of these different elements that people feel with their 5 physical senses, as you just said. People feel it, and so they're responding to what they feel as they turn out. And they don't forget that when they go to the poll. Like, they do not forget what they feel and what they experience and what they're still experiencing in this moment. That makes this such a valuable time. So what are we going to do next? What is the action? What are we telling all of our members across the country that we want them to do? Now, I will tell you, I'm personally a really huge fan of the organization because of our First Lady, Michelle Obama. Let us say her name. Just carrying the vision of seeing action need to take place.
Yeah,
I think it really speaks to this moment. What do we do, Stephanie? What do you want us to go do?
All right. This is very simple. First, I want people to check their status. Make sure you are registered to vote. If you moved, if anything has changed, if you've lived in a state that might have some really crazy voter suppression laws, I just want to make sure you check your status and then ask 3 friends to do the same. That is one thing that we all can do very easily. Secondly, we are having a really big rally called Ramp Up the Vote on August 25th, this Thursday. Join us for that rally. If you go and follow us on all of our platforms at When We All Vote, you can sign up to be a part of that rally. We have some amazing, I can't even tell you who we have on the call because of the fact that we haven't announced them yet, but we have some great celebrity ambassadors that will be joining us if you want to swoon over a couple of people for a second. But most importantly, we're going to get you ready and prepared for National Voter Registration Day and our entire week of action that will take place in September. So starting September 18th, all the way through September 24th, we want you out in the communities helping to register voters with When We All Vote. So that is an action that we all can take. The rally will be fun. We'll have music. We'll have fun people on there, and you'll get trained and learn how to host your own event coming up this fall at the end of September in celebration of National Voter Registration Day and our week of action. That is what we all can do and should do, and I hope you guys join us.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're just so everybody knows, and I hope that people are taking notes and are doing this right now. Everybody should be checking their status as you're listening to the sounds of our voices. You should be checking to make sure that your status as a registered voter is correct, and then getting 3 people to do the same thing.
Yes.
Just add a little something to that. Check your kid, tell your children to use their social media to do that as well, because I mean, my daughter's not old enough to vote, but she sure knows how to work every social media platform.
If she's in high school, we have a program called My School Votes. So if there are any parents on here who have high schoolers, if you're a teacher, we have a whole program called My School Votes. Our goal is to have at least 500 schools part of that program by the end of this year, and we're climbing to that number right now. We love your school to be a part of it. So if you are 14 and a freshman in high school, you can start a My School Votes club at your school as well.
Love it. All right, everybody. So we're checking our statuses, and we're going to make sure that at least 3 people we know have done the same, and then post that, share it, get your kids to do whatever. I've got on my I voted shirt.
Oh yeah, it's so cute. I see that.
I don't even know where I found this, but it just looked like a shirt.
I feel like that's me and Harris. Yeah.
Love it. So we're going to share that, and then ramp up the vote on August the 25th. My interest is piqued because of all the people that you said could possibly be there, but we don't know if they're going to be there or not. So we need to show up to see if they're going to be there. It absolutely ramp up the vote on August 25th, getting everybody involved so that we're doing something. There's always something that can be done. Like sitting on the sidelines, as you said, it's not an option. There's plenty for us to do.
Plenty. And it also doesn't, that's why I gave you the option of just texting 3 friends, because at the end of the day, if you can't commit to anything else, you can at least do that, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, we have more than enough for you to do, and you could also become a poll worker. There's so much, but head over to whenweallvote.org, make sure you sign up for all the work that we're doing and figure out where your place is with us. And don't worry, we will give you plenty to do, and we will back off and leave you alone when you want to do something else, but we have more than enough for you to do. So thank you all so much.
Stephanie, it has been so wonderful listening to you and talking with you and sharing the joy of what we have to do, not only in this election, but in so many more elections to come. I'm excited that you are a part of the EDF Action family and that we are really working together collectively to bring climate awareness and voter action to all of our members and beyond. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Heather, and thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody for joining today.
All right.
Thank you, Heather and Stephanie, for that empowering conversation on voting rights, environmental justice, and our path forward for protecting and expanding access to the polls. Next, we'll be hearing from Kat Calvin. Kat is the founder and executive director of Spread the Vote, an organization focused on ensuring voters have IDs and everything they need to vote. Kat also serves as the CEO of Project ID Fund. As a lawyer, activist, and social entrepreneur, Kat built these organizations to help Americans obtain IDs. Kat, thank you so much for being here. I'll pass it over to you to share your expertise in a briefing on voter ID laws and how these laws could affect voters in 2022.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Saachi. Like she said, I'm Kat Calvin. I'm the founder and ED of Spread the Vote plus Project ID and the CEO. You can hear my dogs. The Project ID Action Fund. And our whole goal is to make sure that every single American has an ID. There are over 21 million American adults who don't have government-issued photo ID right now, and that makes life very difficult on multiple fronts, which we'll talk about. And what we do with our organization, our nonprofit, Spread the Vote plus Project ID, is we work on the ground, helping folks get IDs, the documents they need, everything they need to get that ID in their hands. And at the C4 side, our Project ID Action Fund, we work on policy issues to change ID policy so that we can make it easier for folks to get IDs. So I'm going to walk just a little through in a short amount of time, because I could talk for hours about voter ID laws, what they are, where they are, how they work, and who's impacted, and a little bit about IDs in general and what they mean to people, and then what you can do about it. You already got some great tips from when we all vote, so I'm sure nothing I say will be original, but I'll throw some things out there. So for anyone who doesn't know, you've been hearing about voter ID laws since 2013, but what that actually means, a lot of people don't know. So essentially in 35 states, there is a law. What it looks like varies, but it says that in order to vote, you have to show some form of ID. This may sound logical until you remember what I just said, that over 21 million adults don't have ID. And this is a real burden for them. Those folks are often unhoused. They can be returning citizens. They can be foster kids who are aged out of system and aren't given IDs. They can be seniors who have a hard time getting IDs, folks with disabilities, domestic violence survivors, all sorts of groups of people don't have ID. And for anyone who has ever been to the DMV, you know how hard it can be to get one. It can be very expensive. There are a lot of challenges. You know, for one, if you are unhoused and you have to show multiple pieces of proof of residency, that right there can be a real challenge for you. So we have all these folks who have this challenge in getting ID. And all of those people also have a constitutional right to vote, but then we have laws saying, well, you can't vote unless you have this ID. It's absolutely a poll tax, but it also makes voting and being heard at the polls incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for people. And of course, you have to remember that when you are looking at who's voting and who's getting to make their voice heard, the people who are most vulnerable are the people who are most sensitive to changes that the government makes. They rely on the government most. They rely on social services the most, but they can't vote for the people who are making those decisions. So it really impacts our lives. You know, that stat that you just heard about climate change's real most vulnerable populations are people who are most impacted by the climate and therefore most likely to vote for climate improvement measures. Many of the people who don't have IDs are Black and brown and vulnerable, and we want them to be able to vote both for their own good, but also because the things they vote for will very often be the things that are for all of our own good. And they can't in many states because of voter ID laws in a majority of states. Now, what those IDs look like varies, in pretty much every state. If you have a passport or a military ID or a valid state ID, those are types of IDs that are valid almost everywhere. But other than that, it ranges, In some states, you can vote with a student ID, and some you can't. In Tennessee, you can vote with an ID if you're a faculty or staffer, but not if you're a student from that same school with basically an identical ID. People make a big deal about being able to vote with a gun license in some states and not a state ID, which sounds bad, but you need an ID or a student ID. You need an ID to get a gun license. I know this because I thought, I'm just going to go to Texas and get all the brown people gun licenses. And then I realized the flaw in my plan. But there's all sorts of different rules, and some states make it really difficult, whereas some states have a very wide number of types of IDs that they will allow. And so it really just ranges depending on the state. But regardless, if you are a person who does not have an ID, if you're a person that's unhoused, it doesn't matter really often how many types of IDs they allow, you don't have them. Our organization works on the ground every day with folks who don't have ID. I live in Los Angeles. I'm in Skid Row multiple days a week, helping folks get ID who live in tents and for whom the cost of a birth certificate is out of reach. Not to mention that if you go to Vital Records and ask for a birth certificate, they will ask for your ID. But if you need a new ID at the DMV, they will ask for your birth certificate. So it's a real catch-22. Getting a social security card. In most states, you need a social security card, not just the number, in order to get an ID. But trying to get a new social security card without an ID, another real challenge. And then there's the cost of the ID themselves, which can range from, if you're lucky and maybe you live in a state where if you're a senior, your ID is free, or if you're a disabled veteran or something, maybe it's free. Usually not, though. Usually it can cost $20, $30, $40 even, sometimes in some states even more, to get your ID. And so we have folks who need these IDs to vote and for other things, but don't have a way to get it. And so regardless of the type of ID that is being requested, passports are wildly difficult to get. Military IDs, you have to be in the military or family member of military, et cetera, right? So they're all really big challenges. Outside of voting, though, when we think about voting, we just think about actually going to the polls and we think, oh, well, that's separate from sort of life, but it's not. One of the things that you realize when you work with folks who are very vulnerable is that voting it's really a luxury, right? For those of us who have a place to live and a meal every day, or multiple meals every day and a car and whatever, voting seems like a thing to think about. But for millions and millions of people in this country, you can't think about voting because they don't know where they're going to sleep at night. They don't know where they're going to eat or how they're going to feed their children, right? Like all of the very immediate needs. And so one of the things that having an ID helps people do, and it helps them, get access to shelters and food banks, many of which require ID. It helps them get access to jobs. Almost every housing placement program in the country requires an ID. You need an ID to enroll your kids in just about any program, including school. You need an ID to enroll in any social services program. If you want SNAP or WIC or Medicare or any sort of social services program, you need an ID, right? And so what we see is that when we're trying to get people civically active, that is a difficult thing to ask of people whose basic needs aren't met. But if we make sure that they have those basic needs or even have the mechanism with which they can access them, then talking to folks about voting and getting them to think about voting is a totally different conversation. And so we have to think about what are all those steps. And if we're thinking about, okay, we care about climate change because we're all going to die in like 10 years if we don't. And it's really, really important that maybe we elect like 2 people who care about climate change somewhere. And what we really want is for people to vote and to vote for climate improvement measures. We can't start at the climate, and we can't even start at voting. We have to start at, do you have a safe place to sleep tonight? Do you have a job? Do you have all of these other things? And then once we know that people are safe, we can then talk to them about, okay, now let's talk about voting. And then once we help them understand, do they have the ID they need to vote? Do they know where they want to vote, right? Do they know all of the challenges? You know, what are you going to do with your children? Is it ADA compliant, right? All of these other things. Then we can really start to talk about the issues. But unfortunately, where we are in this country, we have to take those steps. And a lot of times what we do is we go and we talk to really vulnerable people just about the thing we care about, and we forget to talk to them about the things that really matter in their lives. And I think that's a really, really critical thing to do. And it's what I would say when we talk about what you can do, you know, a huge thing is when you're doing voter outreach, or you're organizing, or you're volunteering with organizations, or you're even talking to your community, think first about where they are and where they're coming from and what's important to them, and start there. And then you can work your way through conversation to the issues that you really care about. But you really have to start with where the other person is first. You know, there are so many different voting organizations. My big thing is choose a good one that can show you that it's making a measurable impact, right? Can they tell you how many people they've gotten to the polls? Can they tell you how many voter guides they've handed out, right? Or whatever their thing is. And are they working in your community? There is zero community in America that has 100% voter turnout. Minnesota is the voting champion of all time. They have been the best voters in the country for decades. They have the higher turnout than anyone else. Minnesota wins on voting. They're still at like 70, sometimes 80%, something like voter turnout. They're not at 100%. The rest of us really feeling. And a lot of people who are from states like me in California, where we think we're doing really well, we just had an election in California and we had like 11% turnout. So what I constantly want people to think about is, how can you get people in your community to vote? Can you get your family voting? Can you get your friends out to vote? Can you get your church or your yoga studio or whatever? Can you get your community to vote? If we could all get our immediate community to have 100% turnout, then we would have 100% turnout around the country. But doing that work in your community over long periods of time and really talking to people and understanding people, that's what makes the difference. And if we all work at home, then eventually we will all get to 100%. So for me, that is a really big thing. You know, on our C4 side, we're also working on some policy measures that will significantly expand voting. So if you want to follow along with that, you can go to projectidaf.org and sign up for our newsletter. We have some really exciting things coming up, because as much as I love helping people day to day get an ID, what I want is for everyone in this country to just have one, so that we don't have these issues at all. And that's what we're really working towards. We're working towards big policy change, but also helping people every single day. And that's really what we have to think about, whether it's the climate or homelessness or education or anything else, is how can we look at the big picture, but also really pay attention to the details in the meantime. So I'm going to stop there because we're going to have a Q&A. So Saachi, bringing you back.
Great, Kat. Thank you so much. We will be jumping into Q&A. And the first question is, we've heard a lot about recent Supreme Court cases on voting rights. Could you talk a bit about how Supreme Court rulings this year have impacted voting access in 2022?
Yes. So I'll start back just a little bit to be helpful. So presumably everyone's heard of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was an incredible thing that expanded voting significantly around the country until 2013. And really 2012 is when the Supreme Court really started taking pieces of it away. And we had Shelby County v. Holder, which is what allowed voter ID laws to rise, and a lot of other anti-voting measures. And we've sort of progressively since then seen the Supreme Court take pieces of the Voting Rights Act away and water down, I guess I'll say, voting rights protections. We saw them do the same thing this year. I mean, you know, it's no secret sort of where the Supreme Court is right now, and they're pretty anti-voting, and they're very states' rights focused, which is kind of disastrous in a lot of ways. It's why we had a Voting Rights Act in the first place. And so what we've seen the Supreme Court do this year is, on the one hand, say states get to make decisions about voting laws. And so, you know, we're going to roll back any federal protections because it should be up to the states. But we've also seen them once or twice and Supreme Court does this a lot, where they don't really want to make a harsh decision. So they'll make it really vague, which provides zero protections to anybody, which they've also done. And so where we are now is we have a significantly weakened Voting Rights Act. I'm really crippled in many ways. But we also know that there are very few things that a state can try to do that the Supreme Court will say is not okay, which is a problem in itself, because we see states sort of try more and more extreme measures because they know that SCOTUS isn't going to knock it down. And the Supreme Court is going to take up at least one next year voting rights case that could really debilitate voter protections and people's ability to vote freely in this country. And we'll sort of see the decision they make. But where we are right now with the Supreme Court is there isn't a lot that they're going to stop states from doing in order to protect voting.
Great, thanks, Kat. Our next question is, can you share advice for our viewers on how to vote by mail and track their ballots this cycle?
Yes, so actually, we have a website, readtheeffingdirections.com. We are right now in the process of updating all of the new laws for 2022. So by the time voting opens, it will be totally updated. But on that site, readtheeffingdirections.com, we list out very clearly what all of the instructions are for each state and how to vote by mail. Young people are 5 times more likely to get their ballot thrown out, and Black people are 3 times more likely to get their ballot thrown out. And it is not because young people or Black and brown people are dumber voters. It's because young people are new at voting, and often Black and brown people are newer at voting by mail because the laws change so much that it makes it hard to vote. And so what we've done on readtheeffingdirections.com is try to make it as simple as possible for you to follow every single instruction for each state. And we're updating it now because the laws changed a lot in the last year or so, and we want to make sure that every single law is updated. But I would recommend going to our website when you're voting, and we'll have all those instructions for you.
Awesome, Kat. I think we have time maybe for one more question. I'm sure you and many members of your organization are talking to voters all the time, especially those that haven't turned out before. What are you hearing from voters in this political landscape, and what has surprised you?
You know, that's a good question. It has changed a lot. I would have given you a very different answer at the beginning of the summer than I am now, partially thanks to the Supreme Court. You know, I think that there's no one in America over the age of like 2.5. I don't know anything about toddlers, but I assume even they know that voting is critical, and we have all seen what happens when the wrong person gets into office, right? So we all know. We don't talk to anyone who doesn't know that voting is important. There are things though that are difficult. It's difficult for people when they vote in a party that says that they're going to make change and then doesn't, and then they wonder, well, what's the point here? Nothing changed. One thing that is difficult for people, and that we talk about all the time, and that I never shut up about, is that people, only look at the presidential election, which is fair. It's huge, right? And we're all voting for, it's the only time we all vote for the same person. But we all also vote. And so a lot of people feel like their vote doesn't matter. And people don't think about state and local elections, but state and local elections are everything. 80% of the decisions that are made that impact your life are made at the state and local level. They are literally everything. And they're also smaller margins of voters, right, than the, I don't know, 3 trillion people we have in America who vote for president. And there's, you know, the electoral college and all of this, and it's all very confusing. You don't have that when you're voting for mayor or city council or your member of Congress, which is a local election, really, or, you know, governor, secretary of state, etc. But those people are critically important. And so we get a lot of folks who feel like, well, my vote doesn't matter. And then when we say, haha, let me tell you about city council and how important they are and what they do and how few people vote for it. And then people are like, oh my God, I had no idea. And so one of the things that's so important is for us to help folks understand that these local elections, if you don't think your board of supervisors matters, your board of supervisors runs your life. You know, like the sheriff, the district attorney, these people matter, and very few of us are voting for them. Don't even get me started on judges. I mean, come on. And so that is really what we hear all of the time is my vote doesn't matter if there's too many people. And once we talk to folks about state and local elections, it really changes their mind and it helps people get why it's so critical for them to turn out.
Thank you so much, Kat. That's all the time we have for Q&A today, but we really, really appreciate your time and your expertise. Before we conclude tonight, I'm going to hand it over to Heather Toney for a really quick action ask.
Thanks so much, Saachi. I was sitting here making sure I was following the directions because I could listen to Kat all day long, and I have bookmarked that website to make sure that not only am I sharing it with all of my friends so they don't F this up, but that we are also constantly reminding each other what's at stake for this election. So I'm excited that we're moving into action because that's what it's all about. As we've discussed, exercising your right to vote is crucial to building a more just, equitable, and healthier world. Our democracy depends on voters turning out and advocating for their rights. So it's all about us showing up. We can talk all day and host webinars all night, but it comes down to Election Day and people exercising their right to vote. Voting matters, and voting has impacts and consequences. That's why we're asking you to take an action now by pledging to vote this November. Use the link on your screen and provide it in the comments on Facebook and YouTube to pledge to vote today. Make this pledge today. And once you take the pledge, we'll reach out with emails and reminders about voting in this cycle. It's so important that you do this not only for yourself and your family, but you spread the word. So make sure that you're sending out a tweet or using your Instagram, your Facebook, sharing this with members of your family, you're at your work, at school, at church, everywhere. Everyone needs to understand how important this is, and your circle is important as well. So don't keep this information to yourself. Share it right now and make sure that folks are following and reminding them to get out and register and show up to vote. Together, we'll build a pro-climate majority in Congress that is committed to taking bold action to protect our planet and the health of our communities. And guess what? If we do what Kat just said and vote in every single election, we're going to build a pro-climate community throughout every level of government that ensures that action is taking place in our communities and that we are seeing it, we're doing it, we're a part of it, we're normalizing climate action. So you know what to do. Make sure that you're taking that action to pledge to vote this November, and for every November and every election afterwards. Use the link on the screen, sign up, and share it as well. Saachi, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I'm hoping that there's a lot of action that's taking place right now.
I hope so too, Heather. Well, with that, I just want to say a major, huge thank you so much to this incredible panel of speakers. I personally am so inspired by everything I've learned this evening, and I am so, so thankful for the dedication of these amazing speakers to making our democracy stronger. Please take a look at the links in the comments to take action with us and follow along as EDF Action engages with voters and volunteers across the country this cycle. Thank you so much and have a great evening.